Welcome to Insights in History. My name is Marilyn Thompson, and I'm the Marketing Director here at the History Museum. I want to thank the presenting sponsor of Insights in History, Tousley Hall Canopa. Their generous support helps make this program possible. Now in its 18th year, Insights in History has presented over 400 topics to audiences like you. We miss having you here in person, but until we can be together again, we're happy to be able to provide these virtual programs for you. So thank you so much for your support, and please enjoy this month's Insights in History.
Today we're going to be talking about World War I and the Olivers. We'll be looking at how it affected the area through a series of stories relating to the Oliver family. So not only will we be talking about the family and their experiences during World War I, but also how those experiences relate to South Bend as a whole. So who are all of the Olivers? So we have James I, the patriarch of the family, and his wife Susan Catherine Oliver, their daughter Josephine Ford and her husband George Ford, and their son J.D., who married a woman named Anna, and they had their oldest son James II, their oldest daughter Gertrude, their youngest son Joseph Jr., and their youngest daughter Catherine. J.D. and Anna built their family home, Copshaholm, here in South Bend in 1897. It is a 38-room mansion, and these are just a few interior shots of their home. In 1914, just before the start of the war, the Oliver family was doing a variety of things. So at this time, James Oliver, the patriarch of the family, has passed away. J.D. is 63, and he is planning some new housing on the south side of South Bend for his workers. James II is 28, and he is the vice president of the Oliver Chilled Plow Works. Joseph Jr. is 22, and he is the treasurer of the Oliver Chilled Plow Works. He was appointed treasurer in 1913 after graduating from the University of Chicago. Gertrude is 25, and she has gone on a grand tour and is living a life of parties and tennis. And Catherine is 18, and she has just started at the Finch College in New York. We'll also talk more about a couple of other people, Charles Frederick Cunningham and Eleanor Macmillan, who are not yet known to the family, and they'll become known to them later on. The outbreak of the Great War happened so quickly that many people around the world were caught unprepared, as a great number of people traveling abroad were trapped in Europe, unable to return home. In a letter written August 28, 1914, J.D. Oliver writes to his son James, "Since this terrible condition has become established fact, I am sure the old girl will never look as good to them again." The Olivers didn't expect this to hit quite so close to home as it did. As one of these unfortunates was one of their maids, Betty Kirsch. Betty was an Austrian immigrant who had traveled home to visit her family in Rosenthal, Carinthia, sometime in 1914. And when the war broke out, she was unable to return to the United States. She writes to Joseph Jr., "I think that I will never have the opportunity of seeing America again. I do not think the ships will leave again until the war is over, and that may probably be for a year." Joseph Jr. must have brought her plight to the attention of his father, J.D., who replied to her in September. He went to Chicago and sought the aid of the International Harvester Company, who had agents in Zurich. By October, however, Betty's 4 brothers had gone to the front lines, and Betty had to stay at home to take care of her mother. Shortly after this, the front moved to Rosenthal, and the area became very dangerous, and food shortages became drastic. Eventually, the Olivers were successful in getting Betty back to the U.S., and she arrived in Chicago on December 17, 1914. However, she wrote that she now planned to marry, and that she hopes Mrs. Oliver has good girls working for her now. Apparently, her gratitude did not extend to returning to work, nor did she seem to have a beau in mind, as she then moved to Cleveland and married in April 1916. Before World War I began, the economy was in a state of depression, which J.D.'s financial advisor described as bleak. Once the war broke out, fighting in Europe meant a decrease in the export market and availability of materials. In September of 1914, the governor of Indiana, Frank Hanley, asked J.D. to support his temperance movement. J.D.'s reply illustrates his situation, saying, "I find it difficult to return a negative answer, yet under present conditions do not see how I can do otherwise. In all my business experience, I have never been confronted with a situation such as present exists, and a problem is before me which gives me great concern. Here we are running our factory on nearly full time and piling up goods for which there is no present market, and all because our 2,000 workers and their families must be provided for. Winter is coming on, and I feel that I must do all I possibly can for these operatives and their dependents. So you can see I have my worries of no small caliber. The European war has shattered our hopes of business success for the coming season, and for the time being at least, it must be my entire effort to take care of the home people who depend upon me. Oliver was not the only local industry to suffer. The Singer Manufacturing Company had to lay off a large portion of its employees and shorten the workday to 8 hours a day, 4 days a week. Studebaker had been forced to close its doors entirely, and many businesses, such as Studebaker, partially recovered by making things like munitions to sell the European powers, but Oliver refused as their biggest client was a German family. After the United States entered the war in 1917, the government heavily promoted food production and the need for plows increased sharply. At the same time, the factory was short-handed as workers enlisted or were drafted into the armed forces. Many were replaced by female workers, seen here. Now I'm going to specifically talk about Joseph Jr.'s involvement in the war, both in his civilian life and later in military life. The whole family leapt into action when the U.S. entered the war. J.D. became involved by fundraising using war savings stamps. James is managing the Oliver Chilled Plow Works. Anna and Catherine are involved in local organizations like the Motor Pool and the Red Cross. Gertrude and Frederick were living out east at this time since Frederick was working for the United Cartridge Company, an important ammunitions company, and they lived there until after the war, presumably because Frederick didn't want to leave an important ammunitions company during a world war. And Joseph Jr. is on his honeymoon with Eleanor Macmillan. At the same time, the Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which meant that all men had to register with the draft board, and 2.8 million were called up eventually. Since Joseph Jr. was on his honeymoon, J.D. registered for Joseph in June of 1917. In July, J.D. wrote to him that his number was so high that the drawing does not personally interest him. Joseph was given deferred classification because of his position as treasurer at the Oliver Chilled Plow Works, which was considered an essential industry for the war. In September, Joseph Jr. accepted a position of assistant at the Exports Administrative Board, which concerns exports during wartime, saving things like fuel, flour, and ammunition for our troops and prohibiting their export. It was an enviable position as it allowed a young man to make important connections while also being exempt from the draft. According to a friend of J.D.'s, Henry Ford offered $50,000 to get his son Edsel a position with the Exports Administrative Board without success. Later, in February 1918, he was appointed the assistant director of the War Trade Board, which had a similar function. Now, I wouldn't have mentioned the draft if it hadn't come into play at some point. In June of 1918, some confusion arose as Joseph Jr. got notice that he had been drafted. Joseph had actually wanted to enlist months ago, but his supervisor at the War Trade Board requested that he stay. He was supposed to be exempt because of the War Trade Board, so J.D. called influential friends to help straighten things out, senators, judges, and even the governor of Indiana. He felt that the end of the war would be very soon, and if Joseph was deployed, it would take him many months to get home, and the Oliver Chilled Plow Works needed him desperately. But the bureaucracy of the draft board won. Joseph Jr. resigned July 23, 1918, from his position on the War Trade Board, and he reported to the local draft board in Washington, D.C. On July 24th, J.D. writes that he is anxious to hear from Joseph because he rather imagines that you are now in some camp near Washington. Joseph Jr. arrived at Camp Meade on August 3rd. Up to 400,000 soldiers and 12,000 horses passed through Camp Meade during World War I. On August 11th, Joseph Jr. writes to J.D., and he is talking about being vaccinated, but clearly does not understand how vaccines work. In his letter, he states, "It has been a week last night since I arrived at camp, and the time has certainly rushed by. Camp life now isn't quite so new to me, and it commences to seem like the usual thing. Taking my first needle last Monday didn't bother me at all. In fact, I hardly felt it. It reminded me of Henry Ford's factory, the rapid way they handled us. Tomorrow we probably will get our second needle. I can't see the mark on my arm that it has worked at all on me. The life here isn't at all bad. I really quite like it. It will certainly put me in splendid physical shape. There is no doubt about that. It is a good education for some of these men. They make them shave, take baths, keep their hair cut, brush their teeth, keep their clothes clean, and their bed in order. It will do some of them a world of good. Every day a lecture is given in the barracks or outside in the shade. The following are some of the subjects: proper care of the teeth, first aid, general orders for sentinels, proper care of your dogs. Dogs are what they call feet in the Army. Why we are at war, military law, and policing. Policing means cleaning up. Joseph continued to write during his time at Camp Meade and included a little bit more on some of those lectures. So on August 12th, he wrote, "During the afternoon, we heard 2 lectures, one on rules for sentinels between 1 and 2 o'clock, and the other on venereal diseases or venereal troubles. Our lieutenant was very good on the venereal question, made everything very plain, talked right from the shoulder so that everyone had no difficulty in understanding what he was driving at. If the outside world did as much regarding this question as is done in the service, it would certainly help loads. The young men that gave this talk had spent quite a number of years in China while in the services, and had much valuable material to talk about." And then later on, Joseph gets placed in the artillery division, with some more encouraging words from his father on August 26th. "I notice by the address you have furnished Gale that you have been placed in the artillery division. I would suggest that it might be well for you to learn to shoot a pop gun before you undertake to handle one of the 75-centimeter guns." In September, J.D. applied with the War Industries Board to get Joseph on an industrial furlough. Joseph was granted a 10-day furlough on October 26th, at which point he got to go home for a bit, and this photo was taken. This photograph was also taken during Joseph's furlough of himself and his wife, Eleanor. On November 13th, the hostilities have ceased. J.D. is sure that Joseph will get discharged soon, saying he hopes they will be home for good not later than Christmas Day. By November 29th, Joseph's furlough has been revoked. He had to return to Camp Meade to be discharged in the regular way. By December 4th, Joseph is now a sergeant, and he has been transferred to the 154th Depot Brigade instead of artillery. The depot brigades have new recruits and provide them with training and equipment before they are sent off, and they also do discharges. The depot brigade might be engineering, or might just be where Joseph's staying while he's being discharged. J.D. writes Joseph urgently that Joseph needs to return home to attend to reconstruction efforts. He says that now that the war is over, he is no longer willing to submit to the inconveniences caused by Joseph's absence. Unfortunately, the very next day, on December 5th, Eleanor is hurt in a horseback riding accident. Joseph is discharged on the 13th or around there, and at that time his brother-in-law Frederick reports that Eleanor is in improved condition and probably will not be paralyzed, and that there is a full chance for recovery. However, complications from her injuries proved to be fatal about 9 months later. World War I proved to be one of the most tumultuous periods in history for the Olivers, and by 1919 everyone had finally returned home. J.D. was back as the head of the Plowworks full-time. His oldest daughter Gertrude and her new husband Frederick had settled into their home at 630 West Washington and welcomed their first child, with Frederick as the new secretary. Joseph Jr., now a widower, had moved into the suite at Copshaholm that he would live in for the rest of his life. Catherine had graduated from college and also returned to the family home.